Welcome back to Empire Reimagined, Power and Politics in the 21st Century. I'm Kaede, and our journey through modern imperialism's twisted labyrinth continues. Last time, we dissected America's particular brand of imperialism, that special blend of America first, rhetoric that somehow always translates to America overall in practice. Today, we're turning our analytical microscope eastward to examine Russia's shadow, imperial nostalgia and the Ukraine war, where we'll see how a different flavor of conservative nationalism creates remarkably similar imperial outcomes. If America's imperial project operates under the guise of promoting freedom, Russia's operates under something far more potent and dangerous: the intoxicating liquor of historical grievance mixed with civilizational destiny. The Ukraine conflict represents perhaps the most transparent case of conservative nationalist imperialism in action. A naked territorial grab wrapped in the comforting blanket of historical revisionism and cultural preservation. By 2025, Russia's occupation of approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory will have transformed from a special military operation into something far more permanent. A systematic imperial project focused not merely on territorial control, but on complete cultural, political, and economic absorption. What makes this case particularly illuminating is how explicitly Putin's regime has deployed conservative nationalist rhetoric, appeals to traditional values, civilizational heritage, and historical continuity, to justify what amounts to old-fashioned imperial conquest with modern weapons. The brilliance of conservative nationalist imperial rhetoric lies in its ability to transform aggression into protection, invasion into liberation, and occupation into reunification. When Putin declared in his infamous February 2022 speech that Ukraine never had stable traditions of real statehood, he wasn't merely making a historical claim. He was executing a classic imperial move straight from the conservative nationalist playbook, denying the legitimacy of the target's sovereignty. This rhetorical maneuver has appeared in virtually every imperial project throughout history, from British colonization in Africa to American westward expansion. The conservative nationalist innovation isn't in the technique, but in the particular emotional resonance it creates, connecting raw power politics to deeply held beliefs about identity, tradition, and civilizational purpose. Russia's imperial nostalgia operates from a remarkably consistent historical playbook, drawing direct lines from Catherine the Great's expansion into Novorossiya, New Russia, in the 1700s, to Putin's annexation claims in eastern Ukraine. This isn't mere rhetorical flourish, it's strategic positioning. When Putin explicitly references Catherine's territorial acquisitions in speeches justifying the Ukraine invasion, he's connecting contemporary power politics to an established imperial lineage that resonates deeply with Russian conservative nationalist thought. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Territories once controlled by the Russian Empire or Soviet Union are conceptualized not as independent nations with legitimate sovereignty, but as temporarily separated parts of a greater Russian civilizational space, fragments awaiting reunification with the imperial center. This conservative nationalist framework transforms naked territorial ambition into something far more emotionally powerful: a historical mission to restore proper order. The genius of this approach lies in its appeal to deeply held values rather than mere strategic interests. When Russian officials describe the Ukraine conflict as protecting Russian speakers or preserving Orthodox traditions, they're executing precisely this ideological operation, transforming what international law recognizes as illegal aggression into a moral imperative to protect civilization itself. This conservative nationalist framing proves remarkably effective at generating domestic support, with approval ratings for the Ukraine invasion remaining above 70% despite catastrophic casualties, estimated at over 50,000 Russian dead by 2025. A stunning testament to the power of civilizational narratives over material interests. The historical dimensions of Russia's imperial project extend beyond mere rhetorical justification into concrete territorial targeting. The areas most aggressively pursued, Crimea, Donbass, Ukraine's Black Sea coast, map with remarkable precision onto Catherine the Great's original Novorossiya conquests from the Ottoman Empire in the late 18th century. This territorial parallelism isn't coincidental, but reflects a fundamental aspect of conservative nationalist imperialism: the belief that historical possession creates permanent entitlement. When Putin declared in 2014 that Crimea represents sacred land for Russia, he wasn't simply making a cynical land grab, but expressing a core conservative nationalist conviction that prior control establishes ongoing moral claims. A perspective that, if universalized, would redraw virtually every border worldwide and plunge humanity into perpetual conflict. The most revealing aspect of Russia's imperial project in Ukraine isn't the military occupation itself, but the systematic Russification program implemented in occupied territories. A comprehensive cultural, linguistic, and administrative transformation designed to erase Ukrainian identity and incorporate these regions fully into the Russian civilizational sphere. By 2025, these efforts will include mandatory Russian language education affecting approximately 400,000 Ukrainian children, compulsory Russian passport distribution with approximately 1.8 million Ukrainians forced to accept Russian citizenship, and wholesale replacement of local governance structures with Moscow-appointed officials. This isn't merely military occupation. It's the wholesale absorption of territory and population into the imperial center, the defining characteristic of traditional imperial conquest, dressed in 21st century methods. What makes this Russification particularly revealing of conservative nationalist imperialism is how explicitly it targets cultural and historical markers rather than merely political structures. The systematic renaming of cities to their imperial-era designations, Mariupol becoming Zhdanov, for instance, reflects not merely administrative control, but an attempt to literally rewrite geography to align with imperial mythology. Similarly, the removal of Ukrainian language signs, destruction of Ukrainian historical monuments, and mandatory introduction of Russian historical curricula represent a comprehensive assault on memory itself. Conservative nationalist imperialism understands that controlling territory requires controlling narratives, ensuring that future generations perceive imperial domination not as conquest, but as natural order. Perhaps most sinister in this imperial project is the strategic population engineering through forced displacement and Russian resettlement in occupied territories. By 2025, an estimated 3.6 million Ukrainians will have fled or been deported from Russian-controlled areas, while approximately 750,000 Russians will have been incentivized to relocate there through subsidized housing, tax benefits, and guaranteed employment. This demographic reconfiguration represents the classic imperial technique of ensuring territorial control through population replacement, a method employed by empires from ancient Assyria to the British Empire. When Russian officials describe these population transfers as voluntary migration or economic opportunity, they're executing precisely the kind of linguistic inversion that characterizes conservative nationalist imperial rhetoric, transforming what amounts to ethnic cleansing into benevolent development. Russia's imperial project in Ukraine extends far beyond physical territory into the realm of information and perception, creating what media scholar Peter Pomerantsev terms the weaponization of reality itself. By 2025, Russia will have deployed approximately 37,000 fabricated news items specifically targeting narratives about Ukraine, reaching an estimated 2.8 billion social media impressions monthly through both official state media and covert amplification networks. This isn't merely propaganda in the traditional sense, but a sophisticated reality distortion field designed to create epistemological chaos, a condition where objective truth about Ukraine becomes impossible to determine with confidence. When facts themselves become controversial, power defines reality, a perfect environment for imperial projects that depend fundamentally on denying their own existence. What makes this information warfare particularly effective is its weaponization of conservative values and identity markers rather than mere political arguments. The consistent framing of Ukraine as a threat to traditional values, religious heritage, and family structures taps into deep conservative anxieties about cultural decline and moral corruption. When Russian media depicts Ukrainian society as dominated by Western degeneracy and attacks on traditional families, it's executing a sophisticated conservative nationalist operation that transforms territorial aggression into civilizational defense. This framing proves remarkably effective at neutralizing moral objections to imperial violence by presenting the target not merely as a geopolitical competitor, but as an existential threat to a way of life. The same rhetorical technique that has justified imperial violence throughout history. The effectiveness of this information warfare extends well beyond Russia's borders through sophisticated targeting of specific international audiences with customized narratives. For Western conservatives, Russian messaging emphasizes Ukraine's supposed moral degeneracy and corruption. For Global South audiences, it highlights Western hypocrisy and imperial double standards. For Chinese audiences, it stresses sovereignty protection against Western encroachment. By 2025, these tailored narratives will have generated significant support for Russia's position in key regions, with approximately 47% of Global South populations viewing the Ukraine conflict primarily as Western provocation rather than Russian aggression. This strategic narrative targeting represents imperial information tactics refined for the social media age, dividing potential opposition by exploiting existing tensions and ideological fault lines. By 2025, Russia's imperial project in Ukraine will have been profoundly transformed by the large-scale deployment of autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems, particularly drones, that fundamentally alter the cost-benefit calculation of imperial warfare. With approximately 18,000 military drones deployed across all classification tiers, Russia will have established a new model of imperial control where territory can be dominated with significantly reduced human commitment. This technological evolution doesn't change imperialism's fundamental nature, but dramatically reduces its primary historical constraint: the number of bodies required to control territory. When a single operator can deploy multiple lethal systems across vast areas, imperial powers gain unprecedented capacity to project force without corresponding vulnerability, transforming occupation from labor-intensive to capital-intensive, and thereby reducing one of empire's traditional limitations. What makes drone warfare particularly compatible with conservative nationalist imperialism is how effectively it shields domestic populations from the human costs of imperial projects. With approximately 84% of Russia's territorial control operations in eastern Ukraine conducted through unmanned systems by 2025, the psychological and political distance between imperial center and imperial violence increases dramatically, creating what military ethicist Bradley Strasser terms moral buffering between actions and consequences. When Russian civilians perceive the Ukraine conflict primarily through sanitized footage of precision strikes rather than coffins returning home, the conservative nationalist framing of civilizational mission faces less friction from material reality. The drone thus becomes the perfect technological embodiment of modern imperialism, maintaining dominance while obscuring the human costs that traditionally constrained imperial ambitions. Perhaps most significantly, Russia's drone-enabled imperial project in Ukraine establishes a template that will likely reshape imperial warfare globally. By demonstrating that territory can be effectively dominated through relatively low-cost autonomous systems, Russia provides a scalable model for imperial control that other powers, both regional and global, can readily adopt. This technological transformation doesn't make imperialism more benign, but more feasible across a wider range of contexts, potentially unleashing a new era of imperial competition as the practical constraints on territorial domination diminish. When conservative nationalists in other nations observe Russia effectively holding 20% of Ukraine with sustainable casualty rates, they're witnessing not just a specific conflict, but a generalizable approach to imperial control that could reshape global power dynamics for decades to come. The material dimensions of Russia's imperial project in Ukraine become particularly clear when examining the systematic economic exploitation of occupied territories, transforming what military strategists call tactical gains into strategic assets. By 2025, approximately 73% of Ukraine's coal production, 63% of its steel manufacturing capacity, and 47% of its agricultural exports will fall under Russian control, creating an economic windfall estimated at $37 billion annually. This resource capture represents imperialism in its most traditional form, the forcible appropriation of another nation's productive capacity for the benefit of the imperial center. When Russian officials describe this exploitation as economic integration or development assistance, they're executing precisely the kind of euphemistic reframing that characterizes all imperial projects, transforming plunder into partnership through linguistic sleight of hand. The conservative nationalist framing of this economic exploitation proves particularly effective by presenting imperial extraction not as theft, but as restoration of natural economic relationships. When Russian economic ministers describe rerouting Ukrainian agricultural exports to Russian markets as returning to historical trade patterns, they're deploying precisely the conservative appeal to tradition that has justified imperial extraction throughout history. This framing transforms naked economic predation into proper order, suggesting that Ukraine's economic integration with Russia isn't exploitation, but correction of an unnatural separation. The remarkable effectiveness of this narrative demonstrates how conservative nationalism's emphasis on historical continuity and traditional relationships provides perfect ideological cover for what amounts to systematic appropriation of another nation's wealth. Beyond direct resource extraction, Russia's imperial economic model in occupied Ukraine includes systematic financial integration that effectively absorbs these regions into Russia's economic sphere. By 2025, approximately 93% of banking operations in occupied territories will operate through Russian financial institutions, while the Russian ruble will have completely replaced the Ukrainian hryvnia as the sole legal tender. This financial absorption represents a critical dimension of modern imperialism, often overlooked in purely territorial analyses: the creation of monetary and financial dependencies that outlast military occupations. When economic structures themselves become aligned with the imperial center, political reintegration becomes exponentially more difficult even if military circumstances change. This economic entrenchment represents perhaps the most durable aspect of Russia's imperial project, ensuring that even if frontlines shift, the practical economic reality of these regions remains oriented toward Moscow rather than Kiev. Russia's imperial project in Ukraine reveals a particularly innovative approach to territorial control through what security analysts term proxy imperialism: the use of ostensibly private military companies to establish imperial presence with plausible deniability. By 2025, the Wagner Group and similar Russian PMCs will have deployed approximately 37,000 personnel across occupied Ukrainian territories, performing critical control functions while maintaining a fiction of separation from official Russian forces. This approach creates what political scientist Candace Rondeau's terms sovereignty laundering, exercising imperial control while obscuring formal state responsibility. When Wagner operatives control critical infrastructure, extract resources, and suppress resistance in eastern Ukraine while officially representing a private company. They're executing a sophisticated imperial innovation that provides the benefits of occupation without corresponding diplomatic costs. What makes proxy imperialism particularly compatible with conservative nationalist frameworks is how effectively it obscures power relationships through contractual formalities, transforming naked domination into apparent market relationships. When Wagner's operations in occupied Donetsk are described as security contracts rather than military occupation, or when resource extraction occurs through ostensibly private companies rather than state appropriation, the imperial relationship becomes conceptually mudded. This obfuscation proves remarkably effective at neutralizing opposition by creating what political theorist David Lake terms contractual imperialism, domination exercised through nominally consensual arrangements that mask fundamentally coercive power dynamics. Conservative nationalism's emphasis on traditional forms and formal relationships provides perfect cover for this approach, focusing attention on contractual details rather than material reality. Perhaps most importantly, Wagner's operations in Ukraine establish a new model of imperial control that likely foreshadows how conservative nationalist powers will project force globally in coming decades. By operating through private military companies, states gain unprecedented flexibility to establish imperial presence in contested spaces while maintaining official deniability, a capability particularly valuable for powers with imperial ambitions but limited international legitimacy. When Wagner simultaneously operates in Ukraine, Syria, Libya, and multiple African nations, with varying degrees of formal Russian government connection, it's pioneering a networked approach to imperial projection that provides maximum flexibility with minimal accountability. This innovation doesn't make imperialism less real, but less visible. An evolution particularly suited to an era where formal colonization has become diplomatically untenable, but imperial ambitions remain very much alive. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Russia's conservative nationalist imperialism lies in its explicit weaponization of religious identity as territorial justification, transforming mundane border disputes into sacred geography defended through divine mandate. By 2025, approximately 93% of Russia's official communications regarding Ukraine will contain references to shared Orthodox heritage, with President Putin explicitly describing Kiev as the mother of Russian cities and the Jerusalem of Russian Orthodoxy, at least 37 times in major addresses. This religious framing transforms what international law recognizes as illegal aggression into a holy mission to reunite an artificially divided spiritual community, a narrative that proves remarkably effective at mobilizing conservative support, both domestically and internationally. When Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill declares the Ukraine conflict a metaphysical battle between good and evil, he's executing precisely the conservative nationalist operation of transforming power politics into moral imperative. The genius of this religious imperialism lies in how effectively it creates territorial claims that transcend conventional political boundaries. When Russian officials describe canonical territory rather than political borders, they're deploying a specifically conservative nationalist innovation that establishes imperial claims based on historical religious jurisdiction rather than international law. This approach proves particularly effective because it appeals to a higher authority than merely human institutions, suggesting that modern Ukrainian sovereignty represents not merely a political arrangement, but a violation of divine ordering. By 2025, this religious framing will have generated significant support among conservative Christians worldwide, with approximately 38% of Orthodox believers outside Russia viewing the conflict primarily as a defense of traditional Christianity rather than territorial aggression. a remarkable testament to conservative nationalism's ability to transform naked power politics into civilizational mission. This religious dimension of Russia's imperial project extends beyond rhetoric into concrete institutional control, with the Moscow Patriarchate serving as what security analyst Mark Gailotti terms the advance guard of Russian soft power. By 2025, approximately 8,700 Ukrainian Orthodox churches will have been forcibly transferred from Kiev's jurisdiction to Moscow's in occupied territories, while clergy refusing to recognize Moscow's authority face systematic persecution. This ecclesiastical colonization represents a sophisticated dimension of modern imperialism, often overlooked in security analyses: the use of religious institutions as mechanisms of imperial control. When parish properties are transferred, clergy replaced, and liturgical practices modified to align with Moscow rather than Kiev, it represents not merely religious reorganization, but the systematic reorientation of community identity toward the imperial center, ensuring that even if political control changes, cultural and spiritual alignment remains durably altered. The March 2025 ceasefire described in our previous episode represents perhaps the clearest example of how conservative nationalist imperialism operates through diplomatic formalities that mask fundamentally coercive realities. The agreement, ostensibly brokered by the Trump administration to bring peace to Europe, effectively ratifies Russia's territorial conquest by establishing what diplomats euphemistically term interim administration zones, covering approximately 20% of Ukraine's pre-2022 territories. The genius of this arrangement lies in its creation of permanent facts under supposedly temporary designations, allowing Russia to maintain effective control while the international community pretends the situation remains fluid. When American officials describe this arrangement as stabilizing rather than partitioning, they're executing precisely the kind of linguistic maneuver that has allowed imperial powers throughout history to redraw borders while maintaining the fiction of principle. What makes this ceasefire arrangement particularly revealing of conservative nationalist imperialism is how it transforms naked power politics into moral virtue through appeals to peace and stability. The framing emphasizes ending the bloodshed and protecting civilian lives, rather than the fundamental reality of territorial conquest being legitimized through diplomatic paperwork. This moral inversion, presenting imperial accommodation as humanitarian achievement, represents conservative nationalism's particular genius for transforming power into virtue. When Trump declares the agreement the greatest ceasefire anybody has ever seen, he's engaging in precisely this operation of repackaging Russian territorial conquest as American diplomatic triumph, a rhetorical sleight of hand that obscures how the arrangement primarily serves imperial interests rather than Ukrainian sovereignty. The practical consequences of this ceasefire reveal its fundamentally imperial nature despite the diplomatic packaging. The arrangement prohibits Ukrainian forces from entering interim administration zones while placing no corresponding restrictions on Russian military presence, effectively creating one-sided demilitarization that cements occupation under international monitoring. Similarly, the agreement establishes international financial support for reconstruction while maintaining Russian control over natural resources worth an estimated $3.7 trillion in the occupied territories. This combination of international legitimacy and resource extraction represents imperialism's ideal outcome, gaining the benefits of conquest without the diplomatic costs of formal annexation. When Russian officials describe the arrangement as respecting the will of local populations, despite approximately 3.6 million Ukrainians having fled these regions, they're demonstrating precisely how conservative nationalist rhetoric can transform ethnic cleansing into self-determination through careful framing. As we conclude our examination of Russia's imperial project in Ukraine, several key insights emerge that help us understand how conservative nationalism provides particularly effective ideological infrastructure for imperial ambitions. First, historical revisionism serves as the foundational justification for territorial conquest, transforming aggression into restoration through appeals to prior possession and historical continuity. When Putin declares that Ukraine has always been part of Russia's historical space, he's executing precisely this ideological operation, presenting imperial expansion not as conquest, but as correction of an unnatural separation. This framing proves remarkably effective across contexts because it appeals to deeply held beliefs about identity and belonging while obscuring the fundamentally coercive nature of territorial appropriation through military force. Second, conservative nationalist imperialism operates through comprehensive cultural engineering rather than merely military occupation, focusing intensively on language, education, religion, and historical narrative as mechanisms of imperial control. This approach recognizes that durable imperial projects require not just territory, but consciousness, the gradual alignment of subject populations with imperial perspectives. When Russia systematically replaces Ukrainian language instruction with Russian, substitutes Soviet Russian historical narratives for Ukrainian ones, and transfers religious institutions from Kiev to Moscow's jurisdiction, it's implementing precisely this comprehensive cultural colonization that distinguishes successful imperial projects from temporary occupations. Conservative nationalism proves particularly effective at justifying this cultural imperialism by presenting it not as domination, but as protection of authentic tradition against artificial division. Finally, modern conservative nationalist imperialism maintains plausible deniability through innovative structural arrangements, using proxy forces, private companies, and interim designations to exercise imperial control while denying its existence. This approach represents imperialism's adaptation to an international system formally opposed to colonial conquest, maintaining the substance of empire while avoiding its vocabulary. When Wagner forces rather than Russian army units secure resource extraction, or when occupied territories become people's republics, rather than Russian provinces, the imperial relationship becomes conceptually obscured despite remaining materially identical. Conservative nationalism proves particularly compatible with this approach because its emphasis on traditional forms and formal relationships draws attention to appearances rather than power realities, allowing empire to operate in plain sight while being called something else entirely. In our next episode, The Dragon's Reach, China's economic and maritime power play, we'll shift our focus eastward to examine how China deploys an entirely different imperial toolkit while pursuing remarkably similar objectives. We'll explore how the Belt and Road Initiative creates debt-based control across 149 countries without requiring territorial occupation, and how China's South China Sea claims use historical narratives remarkably similar to Russia's Ukraine justifications. From Sri Lanka's port surrender to Taiwan's economic integration, we'll trace how conservative nationalist rhetoric about Greater China transforms naked economic leverage into civilizational destiny and territorial aggression into historical correction. We'll analyze how China's imperial project operates through financial mechanisms rather than military occupation, creating what economists term debt trap diplomacy, where sovereign nations surrender control over critical infrastructure and policy autonomy. Our case study will examine how Sri Lanka's default on Chinese loans resulted in the 99-year lease of its Hambantota port, a 21st century version of imperial concessions remarkably similar to 19th century colonial arrangements. We'll also explore how China's increasing militarization of the South China Sea with large-scale military drills in 2025 represents traditional power projection justified through appeals to historical maps and documents, demonstrating how conservative nationalism transforms modern territorial aggression into civilizational continuity. Before we conclude today's episode, I want to thank you for joining me in this exploration of how Russia's conservative nationalist imperialism operates in Ukraine, creating a template for territorial expansion that combines historical revisionism, cultural engineering, and innovative control structures. Understanding these dynamics isn't merely academic. It directly affects everything from energy prices to security alliances and democratic possibilities worldwide. If you found this analysis valuable, please share it with others seeking to understand how imperial projects operate beneath diplomatic language and historical justifications. Next week, we'll continue our journey through empire's evolution by examining how China demonstrates that imperialism can wear economic rather than military clothing while achieving similar dominance. I'm Kaede, reminding you that history doesn't just provide lessons, it provides templates, especially for those with imperial ambitions and conservative nationalist justifications.